I go to the Thousand Oaks Ecclesia, but I am Canadian by birth and by citizenship. So I grew up in Western Canada, British Columbia. Grew up in the Okanagan Ecclesia, which is, a lot of you have probably been to Ontario, probably. British Columbia is like Ontario, but cooler because it has mountains. But that's sort of where I grew up. Then I moved to California after meeting the young sister who would become my wife at Manitoulin Youth Conference. So Ontario does have some good things. So yeah, I'm a member of Thousand Oaks Ecclesia. I'm involved with Christophic Heritage School out there with Brother Jason Hensley, and work with the California Kids Camp and the California Youth Conference, which I'll probably be plugging later on this weekend. So let's talk about our topic. So we have 5 classes this weekend. We have 4 classes, and then we have the exhortation. And we're going to be looking at 4 different widows, and then a 5th woman who will share a lot of things in common with the widows we're going to be looking at. So the first widow we're looking at is the widow of Nain this morning. We'll look at the theme of comforting the afflicted. In our second class, we're going to look at the persistent widow, the parable of the persistent widow. We're going to learn about praying through adversity. In our third class, we'll talk about the destitute widow, the one with the 2 mites, who was someone who gave out of her poverty. Then we're going to talk in our first class tomorrow, our Sunday school session, on Anna the prophetess and how we need to learn to speak about redemption. And then we'll talk about ministering in love with Mary Magdalene in our final exhortation. And all these people we're going to be looking at, they just come up for a short period of time in the Bible. They have just a few verses recorded about them. They're kind of background characters to the Gospel. It's not Peter, it's not John. These are people who just are in the background. They were also kind of background characters in the society in which they lived. They weren't prominent people. They weren't people who had a lot of influence in society. And yet, they're singled out as examples of people whose lives were touched by Jesus and transformed as a result. So this is extremely relevant for us young people at this sort of young stage in our lives. We're not really in a prominent position, are we? We're not necessarily out there in front of everybody. We don't have a lot of responsibilities and stuff like that in the ecclesia. So the question that we have overall that we're going to try to answer this weekend is, how can we contribute to our ecclesia? How can we engage in the mission of Christ if we don't have a big prominent role, right? In our day-to-day lives, in our families, when we're at school, when we're at work, when we're at the ecclesia, when we're at CYC, how can we contribute meaningfully to the service of Christ? Because these widows figured out how, and we're going to try to learn from their example. All right, so our first class today is on the widow of Nain, and we're going to talk about comforting the afflicted. And her story is found in Luke 7. So open your Bibles, and let's go to Luke chapter 7. So for our agenda this morning, we're going to talk about 3 points. We're going to first talk about the fatherless and the widows in Scripture to get a bit of an idea of what the Bible says about widows and what their condition was like and what God expected of them and of people around them. Then we're going to look at this unique story in Luke 7, the confrontation at the gate. And then we're going to look at how God visits his people. And our key question for today's class is going to be, how can we practice pure religion? Does anybody know where that quote, that phrase, pure religion, comes from?
James 1.
James, nice. I like the conversation. Great. So James, we'll be looking at that later in our class. So, in the story of the widow of Nain, we're going to see Jesus interacting with a family that has been utterly broken by the ravages of Adam's curse. Okay? It's bad enough that this woman was a widow, right? So her husband had died, leaving her, with very little means of supporting herself or her son. But then, that one son that she had, her one hope of companionship and love and support and family, he too dies in some way. It's a huge tragedy. But we're going to look at how Jesus confronts this tragic situation and how he deals with this problem of mortality in the lives of those around him. And our goal is to gain inspiration to see how we can follow his example of confronting the tragedy of mortality in the lives of those around around us. Okay, I know I asked you to turn to Luke, and you can probably stay there, but just for a few minutes, we're going to talk about the fatherless and the widows in the law. Now, of course, in this story, it's all about a widow and her son who was fatherless, right? So this is a group of people that's very relevant. So, looking at the Old Testament, we're going to break what we consider into three groups. Passages from the law, passages from the Psalms, and passages from the prophets to see what God has to say about these people. So, as you can see here, there's sort of three categories of instruction about widows and fatherless in the law. Okay, you can see most of the passages up there on the screen. So the first thing that God says to people they need to do is to ensure that the fatherless and the widows in your communities, he says, they need to be you need to make sure that they receive justice. Make sure that you defend them. So, for example, Deuteronomy 27, verse 19 says, "Cursed be he that perverteth the judgment of the stranger, fatherless, and the widow." Now, to pervert the judgment means basically to come in and say, to treat them unfairly and to take advantage of them. And God says, if you're the kind of person who goes in and treats vulnerable people in that way, well, then you're going to come under the curse. Okay? And other passages speak of the same kind of idea, that you must stand up for the justice for the widows in your community, for the fatherless, and also for the strangers. Strangers refer to, of course, Gentiles who were in their communities, who didn't have a family or a heritage or an inheritance within the cities of Israel. The second thing that they were supposed to do was to provide for the needs of these poor and vulnerable people. So if you look at all these passages, you would find that specifically Deuteronomy 24, verse 19. That's talking about the tithes. Okay, so you know how the children of Israel were supposed to take all their money or their wheat or their wool or whatever resources they had, and they're supposed to give 10% to the Levites, right? Now the Levites were supposed to take that, and some of that tithe that they had to support themselves, they were supposed to turn around and administer that or give them to the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. So God put in place, in the laws of Israel, a system that would take care of those who had no way to support themselves. All right? And the third thing that God says you have to do for the widows and the fatherless and the strangers found in Deuteronomy 16. And you really should turn this up because I think this is really, really cool. Okay, so Deuteronomy chapter 16. This is a section of the Bible that talks about the different feasts that were going to happen in Israel. Deuteronomy 16. And specifically, we're going to look at verse 11. Okay, Deuteronomy 16:11. It says, we're talking specifically about the feast of the unleavened bread. Okay? Verse 11 says, when you're celebrating this feast, it says, "You shall rejoice before Yahweh thy God, thou and thy son and thy daughter and thy manservant and thy maidservant and the Levite that is within thy gates and the stranger." Is his 16, in verse 4. Rejoice in the feast, thy son, thy daughter, thy manservant. That tells us that God, he wants the people who have no family, the people who do not have a social support system, to be included in those people who do have a family for their celebrations of the feasts. So think about, like, for us, it's not the same, but it'd be like at Thanksgiving. If you have a big family and you're going to have a big celebration together with your loved ones, and you're going to celebrate your family and all the things God has done to bless you, and then you said, hey, there's a person in my ecclesia who doesn't have family in the truth, or maybe who's by themselves, or maybe they're old and lonely, or maybe they're young and they feel out of place. And so you include them in that experience. And specifically, it's about their feasts, which are there to worship God. And so part of what God expected of his people was to say, hey, you're going to celebrate this with your wife, with your kids, also with your employees, with your servants, and then also, he says, with those people. Look for the people in your who need support, who need family. And God is allowing the law to take care of the physical needs, of the safety of people who. Now, why about this? God says the widows something pretty profound.
68, verse 5 says, "Of the father and a judge of the widows is God in his holy habitation." If you want to know what I'm like or how I describe myself, I call myself someone who is a father to the fatherless, and I am a judge or a defender of the widows. But the cool thing is, if you look throughout the rest of that chapter, that psalm, you'll see that those three things that God said he was going to do for the widows under the law are actually things that he does for all of his people. Okay, so we saw that God said that you need to make sure you protect the widow's safety. Well, God says that he's going to make sure that the wicked are going to perish, but that the righteous are glad. And then verse 6, he brings bound with chains. So God says for anyone who's suffering, I defend them, just like I expect you to do for other people who you see in similar situations. Well, God said you have to make sure you provide for the needs of the widows. And he says in verse 9 that he, God, takes care of the needs of his people. He's prepared his goodness for the poor. He daily loads gifts with benefits. And then most significantly perhaps in verse 6, it says that God sets the solitary in families. So God sees people who are lonely. God sees people who are out of place. And he says, I'm going to put you in a family. And he does that primarily through putting them in ecclesias with other brothers and sisters, with other people who also care about God's values. So that's a lesson for what we need to be doing in our ecclesias, to make sure in our CYCs, in our families, that we're not just thinking about our friends, people who we're comfortable with, the people who we're familiar with, but instead we're also going out of our way to try to include other people. Okay, now we come to the prophets. What's interesting about this section is that when the prophets talk about the fatherless or the widows, they're not quite so positive. Because what they're doing is they're actually setting out to rebuke the people of Israel. Why? Because they were not living up to what God had asked them to do. Okay? So in, for example, Isaiah 1 verse 23, actually no, Ezekiel 22 verse 7, God says he's going to judge the bloody city, referring to Jerusalem, because he says, in Jerusalem, in thee, he says, in Jerusalem, people have set light or despised the father and the mother. In the midst of Jerusalem, they have dealt by oppression with the stranger. And in Jerusalem, the people had vexed the fatherless and the widow. So God rebuked the people of Israel. Look, I told you to take care of them, and you're not. In fact, you're making their lives miserable. And so then, in those passages, he admonishes them and tells them what they need to do instead. So for example, Isaiah 1, God, look, Israel, how about this? Learn to do well, seek judgment or justice, relieve the people who are oppressed, judge the fatherless, and plead for the widow or defend the widow. Make sure that when they're mistreated, that you take care of them. God says, if you do this, then I'm not going to get you out of the land. I'm not going to judge you, because it means that you're actually living my word. You're following my law. But if you don't live up to this, if you don't stop the way you're treating these people, God says in Malachi 3 verse 5, he says, I will come near to you to judgment, and I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, and against the adulterers, and against false swearers, and against those that oppress the hireling in his wages, the widow, the fatherless, and that turn aside the stranger from his right, and do not fear me, says God. It says, if you don't stop your behavior and change it so that instead you're worshiping, you're worshiping God and you're taking care of the people who need to be taken care of. He says, if you don't do that, then you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Because it shows, he says, that you don't actually fear me. Because remember in Psalms, God said, I am someone who takes care of widows. And if you're not doing it, it means that you don't fear me, you don't respect me, you don't share my values. Okay? So to summarize what we just learned, in the law, God says, make sure that you ensure that the widows receive justice. He said, make sure you provide for their needs. He said, make sure that you make them part of your family. In the Psalms, he explains why. He says, because that is what God is going to do for you, because it's who he is. It's part of his character. But in the prophets, he gets after them, and he says, look, your mistreatment of the fatherless and the widows is going to bring down God's vengeance upon you if you don't change your ways. Okay? So that is a lightning summary of what the Old Testament has to say about the fatherless and the widows. And that's the context we need to understand when we're going into the gospel records and looking at the situation in which Jesus finds himself. Okay? And he comes in, and what he's going to do is he's going to fulfill this law. He's going to fulfill the spirit of God's law. And he's going to make sure that he is doing all these things. And so watch out for that as we go through this series this weekend. Watch out for God, for Jesus, making sure that widows are treated fairly and are given justice, where he provides for their needs and where he makes them part of his family. Okay? Sound good? Good. Now come to Luke 7. Thanks for bearing with me. If we had taken the time to read Luke 7, you would find that there are of people who Jesus helps or he deals with in this chapter. And I'm going to stop talking until I find the passage. There we go. Okay. So in verse 11, okay, verse 11 says, "It came to pass the day, and many of his disciples, behold, there was a dead man carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow." Much people of the thing when we read a verse like that we have to figure out is when did this happen? It tells us it happened the day after. So the day after what? Take a look at the, see if you can figure out what happened the day before this event. He heals the centurion. Now, the centurion was of what nationality? Probably. I heard Roman, probably Roman. Was he a Jew? Definitely not, right? So he was therefore a Gentile. And the Old Testament word for Gentile was stranger. Very good, okay? So in this chapter, and this is worth writing down, Jesus helps a stranger, he helps a widow, and he helps her fatherless son, okay? So all the passages we just looked at are directly relevant to this chapter, okay? We don't have time to talk anything else about that centurion. Okay, so in this section shows the spirit of the law and the character of God. But as we read through that there's a big contrast, because what we have is actually two groups of people, and they're in two different processions. What we find is that there's a procession of life, and there's this is following Jesus. And Jesus, we know from Acts 3, is called the Prince of Life. And so this procession is following the Prince of Life. Meanwhile, who is leading the other procession in verse 12? It says, there was a dead man. And it says the dead man is leading this procession, followed by his grieving mother and the rest of the mourning townsfolk. Okay? We learn about this son. The son who was leading the procession of life, well, he was the only beloved son of his father. But this dead man is the only son of his bereaved mother. The one procession led by Jesus, led by the other is carried out. The one that goes into the city, this procession of life, it's going with many of Jesus'. Whereas, because Jesus had a whole group of people who he loved and who supported him. But the only person who is directly a part of the family of this young man is his mother. She's by herself. But she does have the city following her. The same phrase is used of both these processions, that much people followed these various processions. And so we have a big contrast, okay? So we have a procession of people who are happy and excited. They have Jesus with them, doing miracles. He's teaching them. They're boisterous. It's kind of like, when we're all going to probably go off and walk towards lunch later on today. We're all happy. We're in a big group. We're with our friends, right? And then coming out of the city is a funeral procession. Have you ever seen a funeral procession? Right? Sometimes you'll see it happen, like you'll be driving through a city and all of a sudden the cop cars show up and the motorcycles and they block off the procession and all these cars drive by. Then when they get to the funeral place or to the graveyard, it's a really sad situation, and everyone's quiet. They're wearing dark clothes, right? Now, back in these days, they weren't quiet. They tended to wail and cry and make a very visible show of their grief, okay? But it's a very different mood, right? And where do they meet? Where do they meet? These two groups, one's going out of the city, one's going in. Where do they meet? At the gate. Very good. Okay. Now, we have a confrontation. Big group of people going through a small gate, big group of people trying to come out of a small gate. Someone has to step aside and let the other one pass, right? Now, typically speaking, if you were in a situation like this, and you were in the procession of life, and there's some people who are really sad with a dead person, would you be like, no, get out of the way, I'm going through? Hopefully not, right? Because we tend to be nice to people who are suffering. And so what we do is we'd step aside respectfully, probably try quiet down. Hey guys, quiet down. There's a tragedy here. Let's just let it happen and sort of be respectful. Okay? Does Jesus do that? No. He is very rude. Okay? Look what he does. In verse 13, the Lord sees this widow. He says to her, excuse me, ma'am, please stop crying. Okay, would you ever say that to someone who had a dead son? Of course not. He says, weep not. And then he comes and he interrupts and he grabs the coffin and says, stop walking with this. Okay? And you can imagine this widow is like, what are you doing? Just leave me alone in my suffering and in my grief. Okay? And then, of course, spoiler alert, he heals and raises the son. Okay? But we have here in this situation, this confrontation at this gate. Who is going to win this procession? Who's going to make way for the other? This is where we got to do a little bit of digging in the Bible and what the elements of are. Okay? See, this told us in the gate that God made to Abraham way back in Genesis 22. Genesis 22, rescued from having to be and this promise involved the idea that Abraham's seed would possess or control the gates of his enemies. Now, who is the ultimate seed of Abraham? Very good. And who is Jesus' ultimate enemy? Sin. That's good. Okay? Not that sin is wrong. 14 to 15 says, through death, destroyed the power of death. That's what he was accomplishing through his death, to destroy the power of death. And the power of death, of course, is the diabolos. It's the idea of sin and the nature that we bear comes from Adam. Is even more explicit. He says that the last enemy that Jesus is going to destroy is death. Okay? And so here we are. Jesus sees this procession of life is confronted with this procession of death. They're at a gate of the city, and Jesus says, well, what's happening here? This tragedy I see in front of me with this dead man and all the sorrow and terribleness that's going to impact life because of the son is a total picture of everything that I came to fight against, to overcome and to destroy. This is death reigning. This is death being successful and winning in this person's life. And it's at the gate of a city, and Jesus is thinking about this promise that he came to possess the gate of his enemy. And in those days, back when city walls worked, gates were really important. If you controlled the gate of the city, you control who comes and who goes. You control the safety and security of that city. So if you have the gate, it means that you have the city. So Jesus says, if I don't take possession of this gate, if I don't change what's happening here, then symbolically at least, my mission hasn't worked. Isaiah 26, verse 2 and 19, talks about the kingdom, and it says, open ye the gates, that the righteous nation which keepeth truth may enter in. Later on in that verse he says, thy dead men shall live, together with my body shall they arise, awake and sing ye that dwell in the dust. It's a chapter The way that God describes in Isaiah the coming of the kingdom and the redemption of the saints as they get to enter open the gates so the righteous nation can enter in. Okay? So again, we have this idea that is at the head of his procession of people who are trying to live for the kingdom. They come to the city. Now they have to enter. They can't stand aside for death to win in this situation. All right? And then finally, Revelation 22, verse 14 says that at the end, after the second resurrection, at the end of the 1,000 years, the end of the millennium, he says that people who are in the New Jerusalem, they have the right to the tree of life, and they enter in through the gates of the city. So hopefully you see the picture of what's happening here. It's like the context Jesus is about to do in raising this person. What I want you to think about for a second, though, is just how tragic the situation was for this widow. Her life was basically over. Her life supporting herself, as we'll see later on, the social structure that was supposed to be there to take care of widows was not in place. It wasn't working. And she's mostly just really sad that her beloved son have died. And in your lives, you may have already experienced some close encounters with death or with some of the terrible things that happen because of our mortality. And if you haven't, unfortunately, you will. Because this world is broken and it's corrupted by death and by sin. And so we all find ourselves, brothers and sisters, young people, we find ourselves in this procession. And this procession of death is started way back with Adam and Eve, and it goes all the way down through time. People are suffering. They're broken by conflict, by disease, by heartache, by broken relationships, by anger, by selfishness, by envy, by bitterness. Everything that is out there that's wrong in this world takes its place in this procession of death. And we're all find ourselves in this. And so we can start to feel overwhelmed by the wickedness and the brokenness of the world, and we can be weighed down by our sense of our shared culpability for that cycle of destruction. The sins that weigh us down that we talk about in our camp hymn. Right, we're connecting it all. We'll get there. Okay, but here we are, we're weighed down by all of this stuff. But the overwhelming positive thing about this story is that God sent somebody to break that cycle. Okay? He said, that procession of death is going to stop, and it's going to stop when I send my son. He's going to confront the procession of death. He's going to overcome it. And that's the story of Jesus. That's the story of the cross. That's the story of the atonement. Jesus comes, he confronts the power of death, he stops it in its tracks, he destroys it, and he achieves the victory. He reverses the tide, and he brings life. And that's the lesson that this widow, the widow of Nain, is going to experience this day. So the Lord sees her, has compassion on her, and says to her, weep not. He comes, he touches the coffin, and those who carry the coffin, they stand still. They're kind of, what are we supposed to do here? And Jesus says, young man, I say unto thee, arise. He that was dead sat up and began to speak, and he delivered him to his mother. That's all we know about the widow. She doesn't say anything in this story. She experiences this wonderful turnaround, okay? But Hebrews 11 tells us something about this widow, okay? Hebrews 11 is that chapter that talks about all the different faithful people, or a lot of different faithful people, right? It mentions Abel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Gideon, David, all these people, right? But did you know it talks about this widow? You're saying, I don't know where that is in Hebrews 11. Verse 35 says that by faith, happened, people escaped the violence of fire, they turned to armies of aliens, or enemies, okay? And he did all these things by faith, these mighty things. They subdued kingdoms, they wrought righteousness, they moved mountains, and women received their dead raised to life again. By what? By faith, okay? Now, for a second, I want you to do some brainstorming, okay? And we're going to use this whiteboard. So, who was raised in the Bible? Shout it out. People raised in the Bible. Lazarus, very good. Who else? Shout it out. Jairus' daughter, great. Who else? Jesus, nice. Widow of Zarephath, etc. Who else? Very good. Shunammite woman's son. Who else? Nice. The guy, ... Okay. Anyone else? We got Jesus? Absolutely. That's the key one we need to know about. Eutychus, most likely. He was taken up for dead and healed. For purposes of my list I'm about to show, I'm not including him. But he definitely was probably raised. You could say that Paul might have been after he was stoned, but doesn't specifically say he was dead. So, yeah. In Acts, Dorcas, a.k.a. Tabitha. I'm much more comfortable with the name Tabitha. I don't know why. But maybe it's because I have like a cousin named Tabitha. Anyway, so good answers. So they're all up here. I did not include the guy who was thrown into the cave of bones or Eutychus because they don't fit the category I'm about to say. But all of these women, all of these people, what did they have in common? What did they resurrect? They all probably had faith, yep. But specifically, they were all raised to be received by women. Okay? So the widow of Zarephath's son, obviously, it's all about his mother, the widow of Zarephath. Same with the Shunammite woman. If you think about the widow of Nain, obviously, you have Jairus, his daughter. It says that Jesus, when he has raised her, delivers her to his parents, not just his father, not just Jairus. His wife was there as well. Okay? Mary and Martha in John 11 with Lazarus, right? It's all about, the story is all about Mary and Martha. It's not even really about Lazarus at all. It's about the faith of Mary and Martha. Okay? And then, of course, when Jesus is resurrected, which we'll be talking about in our exhortation on Sunday, who are the first people to meet Jesus when he's resurrected? Mary Magdalene and the other women, right? And then if you look at Acts 9, verse 44, this is actually pretty cool because Tabitha, what was she known for doing before she was dead? She made clothes for people, right? And specifically, who did she make them for? Widows, okay? If you look through that chapter, you'll see she was there taking care of the widows like she was supposed to under the law. In all of these cases, someone's resurrected and delivered to the people who are closest to that person, who are in almost every case, at least were women, okay? So there's this interesting group of people in the Bible who are women that by faith receive their dead raised to life again. And why is that? Why is it that women are always associated with resurrection? Well, there's some reasons for that we're going to run through really quick, okay? The curse that we all suffer under, mortality, where does it come from? Genesis 3, right? And it was given specifically to Adam, right? The idea that you will labor by the sweat of your brow until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, dust you are, and unto dust, sorry, that's hard to read. But anyway, unto dust you shall return. So you're going to die, you're going to go back to the grave, and that sentence is given to Adam. What was told to the woman? Well, this isn't. Well, the woman was told that she was going to bear a seed, which we'll look at in a second. But what Adam does immediately after receiving this curse, that you're going to return to the ground, you and all your descendants are only ever going to die, what does he turn around and do? It's on the screen. He says, okay, that's a really terrible curse. I'm sorry to experience that. I'm going to give my wife a name now. Wife, your name is now Eve. What does Eve mean? The mother of those who live. Okay? That's weird. Why would he say that? He's just found out that he's going to die, and all his kids are going to die, and all their kids are going to die. And he's like, I'm going to call the mother of this human race the mother of those who live. Why? Well, we'll find out in a second. You see, by one man, sin entered into the world, and death entered into the world by sin. That's what Romans 5, verse 12 says. But the woman was given a different promise in chapter 3. She's told, in sorrow, you are going to bring forth children. It's going to be really hard for you to have kids. It's going to hurt a lot. Take a lot of time. You're going to have a very high mortality rate. When you have kids, it's going to be hard. A lot of mothers, especially back before modern medicine, died in childbirth all the time. Okay? It's really hard. But that process, what was it doing? It was bringing about life. So the curse on the woman, it does involve sorrow. It is a curse, but it's about the idea of bringing forth new life. Adam was just about bringing forth. Okay? And then finally, Genesis 3:15, the curse on the serpent was all about the woman, right? It says to the serpent, you are going to bruise the heel of the seed of the woman, but the seed of the woman is going to crush your head. So in the curse, there was inserted and cemented a prophecy that was going to say, through the seed and the descendants, through that process of painful childbirth, on to there's going to come somebody who's going to crush the head of the serpent, who's going to do the power of death, right? And so 1 Corinthians 15 says, by man came death, for as in Adam all die, so in Christ shall all be made alive. And did Christ have a human father? No, he had a human mother, because it's going to come through the seed of the woman. All the seed of the woman is the line of people who choose to follow God and who are associated with the procession of life that stands in opposition to the procession of death. Okay? And this is all connected to the idea of why it's always women that are associated with resurrection. And if you look at what I think the real reason for that is found in Genesis 2, verse 21 to 24, which says, so Yahweh Elohim caused a deep sleep. So, context, sorry. This is describing the process of creating Eve. Okay? Adam has been created. He sees all the animals. There's no one suitable to be a partner for him. And so God says, I'm going to provide you with a wife. Yahweh Elohim caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam. And while he slept, God took one of his ribs and closed it up its place with flesh. And the rib that Yahweh Elohim had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. And the man said, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. And she shall be called a woman because she was taken out of man. Okay. So think about this for a second. How was Eve created? How was Eve created? Through the man's death, at least in type, right? He's put into a deep sleep. He puts down, so he has to go under. He has to sleep. He has to dead. And through that, a very potentially fatal operation is performed upon him, and out of it, the woman is created. So the woman, who would later be the one through whom life would come, is there, made out of the death of the man. And Adam is, of course, the first Adam. Christ is the last Adam, right? And in that situation, then, what happens when she's born? She comes back, and God brings her to Adam, who has just done what? Risen out of a deep sleep. Okay? So right there, we have a picture of the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus dies. It's tragic. It's terrible. It's sad. But out of that death, out of that sacrifice, out of that suffering, he rises again. And who's there to meet him when he's resurrected? A bunch of women, okay, who are the seed of the woman, who are there, symbolically the bride of Christ, ready to be part of the new creation that Christ was forming. Okay, we have a couple minutes left. We're going to talk briefly about the reaction to this miracle. So, Son, everyone's like, whoa, this is crazy. There came a fear on all, and they glorified God, saying that a great prophet is risen up among us, and that God has... They pay attention. Jesus just raised on a procession of death, and they say, God has visited his people. Now, this word, if you look through the Bible, this is about God's people. Acts 15, verse 14 says that God at first did visit the Gentiles to bring out a people. Genesis 21, verse 1 says that at the right time, God is going to visit Sarah and bring forth Isaac, the promised seed, okay? Genesis 50, verse 24, and Exodus 3, when Joseph dies in Egypt, he says, make sure you take my bones out of here. And by the way, surely, what's he going to do? He's going to bring you out of this land and to the promised land. 6 talks about how God visits his people in bringing bread. The idea of visitation in the Bible is the idea of coming to see what's going on and then to provide a solution. It would involve saving, okay? What's going on in your life, in your situation, and then choosing to. Okay. Now, Jesus, we're told, was God's visitation. Psalm 8 says, "What is man that thou art mindful of him?" Okay? Talking about 68, the celebration by like Zechariah and then Simeon about the birth of Christ, and they say they're really happy because God has through the birth of Christ. And then Luke 7, verse 16, we just read. Now here's a really interesting thing about this idea of visitation. Matthew 25, verse 3, where Jesus is talking to the sheep and the goats, right? He says, same word, same idea, okay? Mentioned at the beginning, so religion is this, to visit the fatherless and the widows. So God expects us to participate in the work that he does, the work of going into these situations where our help is needed. People who are lonely, who are suffering, and we're going to try to help. Because through that process, we become the visitor that Christ provides. You notice what he said in Matthew 25. Look, the people who said, God, Jesus, we never. I know. But you did it to my brethren. And in doing that, we're doing it to Jesus. He expects us to do his work, to join in that work of mortality, whether that's a death or a tragedy, or maybe there's some broken relationships, people need help, and all the different things that happen to us. People have anxiety, people have depression, people have a lot of problems in their lives. And Jesus says, I want you to go in there and help. I want you to bring life the way that I do, the way that God does, the way that God intended. So lessons out of this class. First thing is that God defines himself by his care for those who are afflicted and lonely. He says, I am a friend of the widows. I care about them. So you should too. Jesus himself uses us to care for the vulnerable and the lonely. He's not on the earth anymore. He can't go and give someone a hug. But you can, and he expects you to do it. And then lastly, when you're experiencing sadness and sorrow, when you've experienced tragedy, when you're lost at how broken the world seems, remember that the Prince of Life will not let the power of death prevail. Thank you very much.